The following is intended for informational purposes only. It is intended to supplement classroom training and documentation. It should not be relied on as a replacement or substitute for classroom training with a live expert instructor. Welcome to Lesson 5, Further Form Rules Configuration. In this lesson, we're going to look primarily at the Add Conditional Line Validation form rule, as well as a form rule which uses a rate schedule to calculate how much tax you owe as an assessment, and also a form rule to create the actual assessment. At the end of this lesson, we'll be able to update our form such that we have not only a personal details section, but a simple tax details section that creates an assessment. We will now look at the tax form again, and you will see that we have added some new lines. So if I create a form using the same tax form, you will see that now not only do we have the personal details section, which is over here, as we had it before, we now have a tax details section, and I will first show you how this tax details section needs to be filled in, and then we'll look at the form type to see how it was created. So in the tax details, it has information like enter your salary amount, other income, exemptions, and then the total taxable amount, and then it makes a calculation to work out how much tax you owe. And each one of these particular lines, you will see first of all that there are numbers. You can have numbers for each line, so that if you want to give information based upon the lines, a calculation, it makes it easier if the line numbers are there. And this is also a help bubble, and gives you information about what you need to fill in. So let's just try and fill this in. Let me put in a dummy name again. Any name comes to mind, and put in a dummy here. Now, in the tax details, first of all, it tells me to fill in my salary amount, all employment-based wages. Let's say when I put in 50,000, think of this as a yearly amount. It automatically adds in the dollar sign, because it knows that this particular value is a money value, and we'll see how that's done on the form type. Here we say other income. What does it say? All other sources of income. Let's say I have another 5,000, let's say, income. And then exemptions. What does that mean? Any income which is not taxable. So let's say 3,000 is not taxable, and then it tells me taxable amount salary, line number 10, plus other income minus your exemptions. So that's what I need to fill in here. Let's first of all see what happens if I make a mistake. Let's say I add the first two up but not the last one, miss out the exemptions. And then it tells me the calculated tax amount using a rate engine. Not clear whether I meant to fill this in or not. Let's say I don't know how this is working in my form type yet. Let me just save this like this and see what happens. So first of all, obviously I need a receive date. Put in today's date, and I'll save. Tax details, as we just entered them, personal details. Let's hit validate. I should validate all the information related to the personal details that we've already seen. Oh, it comes up with an error. If I click on this, it will go to it, I think. Not there, but here it will. There you go. The value here says the value is being calculated incorrectly. And in fact, as we know, we didn't put the right amount in. Hey, but look at that. We see that's interesting that the calculated tax amount has been calculated, even though there was an error. So we'll have a look at the form type to see how all this works. But let's first of all edit this and put in the right taxable amount. And here I'm going to add them up. 55 minus 3, 52. So let me change that to 52. Let me save that. And since I actually know something about this, I'm going to actually also highlight something else. I'm going to edit this again. And I'm going to change the amount, not to exactly 52, but 52, let's say, and 50 cents. I just want to know how tolerant it is to things like decimals or things like that. Again, it's not an exactly correct value, so hit validate, but let's see whether it actually cares about the decimal. And we see it's gone to post. So in fact, if I go to tax details, it hasn't got any errors. It calculated this even though it's not an exact amount, so it was tolerant to a certain extent if I don't get the exact amount right. And it calculated the tax based on something. Here it tells me based upon a rate. Now if I just complete this and post, you'll see that I've also added another stage here, which is that not only does it create the obligation needed for this particular taxpayer, but it will also create an assessment amount for this amount, 2,500. So if I have a look over here, this information, person was created, account was created, tax or obligation, filing period created on the validate step, and then we added in here an adjustment. This is an assessment based upon the amount I have here. In other words, 2531. That is the amount that you see over here. Now, it's a little confusing that you will see that on the account and the tax roll, it shows a different, and also an obligation, it shows a different amount, 3,200, and that's related to some other issue, related to the fact that I have been filing a 2010 income tax form 4 years late, and so there are some penalties related to that. So P&I calculates extra adjustments which have been added to the account and to the tax or an obligation. That's why there's a difference of a few $700 roughly dollars because of could also be interest. So what we see here, therefore, is we've added in the ability to add an assessment, and we've also seen that some calculations based upon some validations based upon these amounts, and we also saw that this amount, 2,500, is a calculated tax amount, has been calculated some way. Okay, so how did we do this? Let's go to the form type. And we'll start by looking at the section that I added in. In fact, what I'd like to do is do something slightly different. I want to keep the tax form open because I might actually want to show you the details here as I look at the form type. So I'm going to actually go to here. This will get me to the form. Okay, I will actually just simply search for form type on the second tab here so that I can have two of them open at the same time. Also make it slightly bigger, and I'm going to put in my form type. Okay, so let's have a look at the section that I added in. At the bottom here we have section list, and you will see that we have the personal details, and this is the one that I added in, tax details. We should have five lines added, so let's have a look if we have 5 lines added. and we can go down and we see we have 5 lines added to our section. So let's look at one by one to see if we understand how this works. You will see that you can see the sections on the right hand side, and here we have salary. We have a line number, so that line number 10 corresponds to the number 10 here. Okay. Display sequence means the salary will be the first one in the list. So, we haven't used the reported change reasons or labels, so in fact you don't see any of this information reported yet. We'll might add that in next time. What else do we see? We have based our field on a field called amount, which is a money type, and that's the reason why you see the dollar sign automatically picking up the default currency of the system. And the interesting thing here is I created a new label called salary, and I have a help text that says all employment-based wages, and that's why I have this bubble with that information there. So that explains that particular field. Other income and exemptions are similar. In fact, all 5 of them that we see are very similar to the very first one. Let's just look at one other one. Again, here we have line 20, display 20, other income. It follows exactly the same pattern as we see for the very first one, salary. And all of them are done in the same way, creating a new label with its own help. And that's why we have this information. So that explains hopefully why, how we created this new section with the lines in this in the tax details section. Now, let us now deal with some validation rules. And we saw one validation rule which calculated or gave me an error rather when I put in the wrong value here, right? If I put the wrong value here, it had an error coming up. Which form rule? Where is that form rule? Let me go back to the form type. If I go to rules, you will see now that I have added in a new rule group, this one called tax details validation. And I've added 2 here, this one. And this one actually, let's click on this one first. This one, in the description, I've actually put the exact formula I'm trying to create. I want to make sure that the taxable amount is a salary plus other income minus exemptions. Now this is based upon a form rule called conditional element validation. And the way it works is that you define a reference to the value that you want to add in, you want to validate. And in our case, we would like to make sure to validate line 40. We want to validate that that amount which is entered is actually this plus this minus this. So I put in the rule variable x to be the value that I want to actually test. And then I put in salary, other income exemptions, calling them variables A, B, and C based upon form lines. There are other types you could also base it upon, not only form lines. And then I put a condition in. You can have multiple conditions. In this case, I'm saying that I want X, the taxable amount, to be equal to A plus B minus C. And if the condition is met, if it's true, exit, everything is fine. If false, then I want it to fail. And what does it mean to fail? Fail means that I will generally have a exception information. What type of class and rule action do I... Class meaning which particular status I want to move this particular form into. If it errors in such a way, if the calculation is incorrect, and I put suspense. I can put in the message information, and this was the message information that we saw before. And then I saw sort of the rule condition. What do we want to happen as a result if it fails? And if you remember, in this case, we actually saw that the system continued and went on and calculated the taxable amount, and that's because the rule action was set to continue. If I change that to end to stop, what it'll do is it will stop and not calculate the taxable amount. In fact, I can show you that directly here. If I change this to terminate, which actually makes perhaps more sense, that if the calculation is incorrect, I don't want the information to be calculated. So I just updated the form rule. If I, let's say, create a new form, let's quickly do a new form. Remember the receive date and the personal details. I'm just going to fill in some garbage. I'm not going to really care about it at the moment. Here, I want to show you this. If I put in, let's say, now 1,000, let's say I don't even fill in that, and I make a mistake, and I say that, for example. Previously, what happened was that an error message came up, but then it did calculate the taxable amount based upon the amount I put in here. And that's because I just said now that this was set to continue, the rule action continue. If I put it to terminate now, and I save, and then I validate, we'll see that it now changes. So it comes up with this error. That's the message that we see on the form rule. That's exactly the message we see over here. And I look at tax details. I have this highlighted, but the calculated tax amount is not shown, whereas previously it did. And that's because I've changed the rule, as I just said, to suspense. Okay, so that explains that. The other thing which I want to show you is the tolerance information. I've set the system to be tolerant to up to basically $1. In other words, and I showed this to you before, I edited this now. And I made this 999. You'll see that it should be okay, because I set my tolerance to be up to and including it is up to $1. You can change this value to a fraction, so you can have it a certain percent. It's not percentage, so that amount can be up to a certain percentage, over or under. You can have different rules based upon if it's over or under amount. But if I change this now, as we saw before, and I do validate, this might work now because it's only $1 difference, and I have a tolerance of up to $1, up to, I believe, including. Okay, so that's the reason. If I again re-edit this and I just change this now to something like as you see now, it's calculated the tax amount because it continued on to the next tax form rule. But if let's say I do this like that, so now it's just over $1 wrong. It's inaccurate by $1.01. And you therefore, it comes up with the error because this is now more than $1. Okay, so that explains the tolerance information. Autocorrection is if we want to automatically correct an error without actually erroring. It will calculate the real amount. We'll see an example of that maybe later. So this is the first form rule. Let's look at the second one, which actually does a calculation of the tax. Here we have used a form rule called calculated tax form line using rate. Remember that you can click on the bubble here and it'll give you the information of how this works, and this uses something called a rate schedule within the system. I'm not going to spend time now discussing rate schedules, but it's a calculation engine which can be used to calculate anything, and in this case we are using it to calculate how much tax based upon the taxable amount line, and we're feeding into the engine the rate schedule. It's called a rate quantity called net income of the value there, and it sort of uses an input into the rate schedule, and then the rate schedule will use that information to make a calculation of how much tax you're meant to you owe. Define the rate schedule over here. If we click on here, just to show you where it takes you to this rate schedule, and rate schedules are broken down into rate versions and then rate components, and here basically it's having different bands of tax based upon whether it is certain amounts of 2%, 4%, 6%, 8% tax rate based upon how much you made. So we made 40x amount, and therefore it will make calculations based upon all these different components. So and if I looked at one particular one, I'm not going to go into the details of rate schedules right this moment. You will see that this net income is actually fed in here, called the RQI. Okay, so let me go back to the form rule. So this form rule picks up the information from the taxable amount and puts the value, the right value of the tax amount, into the line tax amount, which I defined there. So that is the second form rule. Again, remember, more information here, and you can look at the detail of how this works. If you want to now, let's move on to the other form rule, the form rule which actually calculated the assessment. So if I go back to the form type, you remember that we have some posting form rules, and I added this one in now, the create assessment. If I click on create assessment, you will see here that you define the particular line tax amount to, in this case, to create an assessment. And that's the reason why we saw whatever value that we had into the tax amount, that's the assessment amount that was created. Okay, so you also need to define your debt, your adjustment type, whether it is a debt or a debit or credit, and that's the third form rule that we have seen. So what have we learned in this lesson? We've seen that as opposed to other form rules, the conditional line validation is sometimes used multiple times, even on the same event, to do all different types of checks on the line validation. So therefore, you don't have to think that you have to use one form rule once for each event. Conditional line validation is a good example where we use it multiple times. We've also seen that the conditional line validation not only can validate a particular line, it can also be used to update and correct mistakes, and or set defaults as well if we need to set values based upon some sort of calculation.